But one key argument against rent control is that it discourages new rentals from being built.
Coupled with rent controls, it's not a very appealing picture.
If developers don't think they can make enough money from a rental building, then they won't build it. If new rentals aren't being built, that's bad for renters. So what happens when rent control goes away? Do more rental buildings go up?
Canada's bustling streets, quiet suburbs, and ever-turbulent real estate market are under a huge threat, one that looms over the housing market like a dark cloud on the horizon. Beneath the surface, a sinister force is gathering strength, poised to strike at the very heart of the nation's economy. As unsuspecting Canadians go about their daily lives, blissfully unaware of the impending doom, those in the know are holding their breath, waiting for the inevitable storm to hit. This storm? Rent control, a well-intentioned policy that has over time morphed into a monster that is devouring the very people it was meant to protect. According to 2021 census data, 10 million Canadian households own their home, while 5 million rent. Statistics Canada revealed that the number of households renting their homes grew by more than 21% between 2011 and 2021. Statistics Canada's Consumer Price Index just saw a 3.1% year-over-year increase in November, and that figure would have been lower if not for mortgage interest costs up 29.8% and rent costs 7.4%. Meanwhile, further reports show that the repercussions associated with rent control were a 15% reduction in the rental supply of small multifamily properties, which led to rent increases and reduced affordability in the long term. In metropolitan cities like Toronto and Vancouver, prices of rentals are on the rise. The monthly rent for an apartment in Toronto, Ontario is $2,610. A one-bedroom apartment costs about $2,424 on average, while a two-bedroom apartment is $3,506. Houses for rent in the city are even more pricey, with an average monthly cost of $3,600. As of February 2024, in Vancouver, renters were paying an average of $2,367 for newly listed units, according to the latest report. While rent control may seem like a beacon of hope for affordability, its unintended consequences paint a starkly different picture. Behind the facade of stability, it often leads to reduced housing supply, deteriorating housing quality, and distorted market dynamics. In this video, we delve into the contentious debates surrounding rent control in Canada, exploring the nuances of its impact on the rental market and dissecting the underlying factors driving its detrimental effects. From skyrocketing rents to dwindling housing supply, we uncover the hidden truths behind rent control legislation and shed light on its implications for both landlords and tenants alike. At its core, rent control is a government-imposed limit on the amount that landlords can charge for rental housing. It is a policy that has been adopted in various forms across Canada, with the stated legal goal of protecting tenants from excessive rent increases and ensuring that everyone has access to affordable housing. This policy emerged for the first time in Canada in Ontario in 1944. Their entry was ushered in by enacting the National Housing Act, a direct response to a dramatic rise in demand for housing after the Second World War, resulting in sharp increases in market rents. A half-decade later, landlord input led to the elimination of rent regulations. Tax changes in the 1970s discouraged developers from investing in new homes, reintroducing rent restrictions. The impact was twofold. Due to a halt in building and high demand for rental properties, new entrants experienced a quick spike in market rents, while existing residents benefited from artificially low rentals. This is a common narrative among Toronto tenants nowadays. Fast forward to 2017, rental control was only applied to apartments developed or occupied prior to 1991. In 2018, the Ontario government altered rent control legislation, thereby abolishing rent control for new units delivered after November 15, 2018. Prior to this date, units were subject to rent control limitations. This action was taken to encourage investors to build more properties and improve the housing supply. Today, each Canadian province and territory has different rent control rules, including frequency limits, increase limits, vacancy decontrol, and how much advance notice is needed ahead of a rent increase. On the surface, it is a notable and compassionate idea. After all, what could be more fundamental to the Canadian values of fairness and inclusivity than the notion that everyone should have have a safe and affordable place to call home. But as with so many well-intentioned policies, the reality of rent control has proven to be far more complex and problematic than its proponents might have imagined. To understand why, it is important to first understand the scale and scope of the problem that rent control is meant to address. According to the Canadian Rental Housing Index, nearly 25% of Canadian households are renters, and of those, roughly 44% are spending more than a third of their income on rent, a figure widely considered to be the threshold of affordability. In some cities such as Toronto and Vancouver, the situation is even more dire, with more than half of renters spending over 50% of their income on rent. These numbers are staggering, and they paint a picture of a country where the dream of affordable housing is increasingly out of reach for a significant portion of the population. It is a crisis affecting not just low-income Canadians, but also middle-class families and young people struggling to get a foothold in an increasingly unaffordable housing market. In response to this crisis, many Canadian cities and provinces have turned to rent control as a solution. The logic is simple. By capping the amount that landlords can increase rents each year, tenants will be protected from the kind of sudden and severe rent hikes that can force them out of their homes and into an even more precarious housing situation. While the intentions behind rent control may be pure, the unintended consequences of this policy are anything but. The first and perhaps most prominent of these consequences is the impact that rent control has on the supply of rental housing. When landlords are limited in their ability to raise rents to keep pace with rising costs and market demand, they have less incentive to invest in new rental properties or to maintain and upgrade existing ones. This is not just a theoretical concern, it's a very real and quantifiable problem that has been documented in cities across Canada. In Ontario, for instance, the previous government moved to expand rent controls in 2016 to provide renters some relief. All it did, however, was further tighten the vacancy rate by removing much-needed rental units from the market. Similarly, in British Columbia, the introduction of rent control in 2018 led to a 25% reduction in the number of new rental units being built in the past year alone. These reductions in supply have a cascading effect on the rental market as a whole. With fewer new units being built and existing units falling into disrepair, the overall quality and quantity of rental housing begins to decline. This in turn puts upward pressure on rents for those units that do remain on the market as landlords seek to recoup their costs and maintain their profits in the face of rising expenses and limited revenue potential. The result is a vicious cycle in which rent control, far from protecting tenants from rising rents, actually exacerbates the very problem it is meant to solve. By discouraging investment in new rental housing and limiting the ability of landlords to maintain and upgrade existing units, rent control creates a scarcity of quality rental housing that drives up prices and makes it even harder for low and middle income Canadians to find affordable places to live. However, the problems with rent control go beyond just the supply and quality of rental housing. There are also broader economic and social consequences to consider. One of these consequences is the impact that rent control has on labor mobility and economic growth. When people are locked into affordable rental housing in one city or region, they may be less likely to move to other areas in search of better job opportunities or a higher quality of life. This can lead to a mismatch between workers' skills and talents and employers' needs, which can lead to slower economic growth and reduced productivity. According to a report, rent control led to a significant reduction in labor mobility, with workers in rent-controlled units being 20% less likely to move to a new city or region than those in non-rent-controlled units. This in turn reduced overall economic growth and productivity as workers were less able to respond to changing economic conditions and opportunities. Another consequence of rent control is the impact it has on the overall housing market. When the supply of rental housing is constrained by rent control, more people may be forced to enter the home ownership market even if they're not financially prepared to do so. This can lead to a distortion of the housing market, with prices being driven up by increased demand from buyers who might otherwise have been content to rent. This is a particular concern in cities like Toronto and Vancouver, where the cost of home ownership is already out of reach for many middle-class families. According to a 2023 report, the median household income in Toronto would need to be $236,221 to afford the mortgage payments on an average-priced home, while in Vancouver, the median household income would need to be an even more stratospheric $237,400. When rent control constrains the supply of rental housing and forces more people into the home ownership market, it can exacerbate these affordability challenges and create a new set of problems for policymakers to grapple with. But perhaps the most insidious consequence of rent control is how it can actually harm the very tenants it's meant to protect. By limiting the ability of landlords to raise rents to keep pace with rising costs, costs. Rent control can lead to a deterioration in the quality of rental housing, as landlords cut back on maintenance and repairs in order to maintain their profits. This is a problem that has been well documented in cities across Canada. In Toronto, for example, half of community housing developments will be in critical condition in the next 5 years without additional funding or repairs. Already, data shows more than 30 social housing properties are in serious disrepair. The report noted that many of these problems were the direct result of landlords' inability to raise rents to cover the cost of necessary repairs and maintenance. Similarly, in Vancouver, concerns are being raised about the condition of existing rental stock, with 7% of British Columbian renters living in units in need of major repairs. Research also found that 11% of renter households in BC were living in overcrowded conditions. The highest numbers were found in Surrey at 24%. The report noted that these problems were often the result of landlords being unable to raise rents to cover the cost of necessary repairs and maintenance, that many renters were reluctant to complain about these issues for fear of being evicted or having their rent increase. These are not isolated incidents, they are the predictable and inevitable consequences of a policy that prioritizes short-term affordability over long-term sustainability and quality of life for tenants. A major factor driving increased rents in Canada is a lack of housing supply, which results in regulations that make housing more expensive. Rent controls have failed to prevent rents from increasing and have failed to provide more affordable rental housing. Population and income growth have spurred demand and worsened the shortfall to the point where Canadians are now struggling to find reasonable housing options, let alone any possibilities. To restore affordability by 2030, the CMHC estimates that an extra 3.5 million affordable housing units will be required. The reality is that unregulated housing markets build more. In fact, the average annual completions as a percentage of 2016 housing stock in regulated versus unregulated markets was 1.44% versus 2.08% respectively, and equates to 44% more housing delivered in unregulated markets. Price-limiting devices such as rent controls impede the balancing effects of classic supply and demand factors. Rent-restricted apartments and houses or controlled units have a tendency to grow at a slower rate than the market. The longer the apartments are rent-restricted, the more they will fall behind the current market rents. The stakes couldn't be higher for innocent Canadians. Already, the housing affordability crisis is taking over Canadian society. Young people delaying marriages and family formation because they cannot afford to buy a home. Seniors and people with disabilities are being forced out of their homes and into precarious living situations because they cannot afford the rent. Families are being torn apart and communities are being disrupted because people cannot find a place to live that they can afford. If there is anything, now is the time for Trudeau's government to take decisive action. The future of Canada hangs in the balance, and delaying action is no longer an option. If you like this video, hit the like button and help us spread the word. And don't forget to subscribe to get notifications on our latest news and analysis. In the meantime, check out one of these videos here to learn more. Thanks for watching.